Welcome to Planet Raconteur, where we who tell stories rule this world. I am your host, Young Nasty. Allow me to be your guide through our world that's filled with sights and sounds, both wonderful and frightening. Do you enjoy stories about time traveling and sex cults? We do too. Our first story of the night is called Collider, and is by author Greg McCann.
This is Collider by Greg McCann. Looks like I'm married to my boss now. Somehow she's become my wife. That is one of my wives. Head wife, of course. Guess she'll always be the boss. It really is strange having all these wives around. They're loyally dedicated to an absurd degree. Doting on me, cooking for me, cleaning the compound, manning the gun ports, killing for me. And the sex. Anyway. Now, I keep asking myself if this is all real. That I've actually become the head of an embattled cult of beautiful women. But of course I know that reality has precious little to do with it. Or maybe it has everything to do with it. I remember wife number one saying to me, "You are our visionary," while she's sitting on my lap in cut-off shorts and nothing else. Her bright green eyes beaming fanatical enthusiasm all over me. But in my memory, she's perched on the corner of my desk in her power suit, back at the offices of the old institute. I remember her saying, "Your problem is you have no vision." She flips a cool hand up from a shapely knee, tucks a lock of auburn hair behind her glasses, and glances absently down at my slumped form, saying further, "That's why you look to the internet for answers." You see, all I want is for our Hadron Collider to matter more than all the others. So what if I look to esoteric sources, but all she cares about is her career? I'm listening with bemusement to the gruffy, clipped voice of the chief negotiator outside. He wants me to know that he knows how this is all going to end. Woven into this terse sentiment of his are the words that I primed him to use. They echo through the shadowy communications room as I lean back in my favorite wicker chair and enjoy a foot rub from wife number three. Side note, she was a bank teller who flirted with me once. These words are a mathematical code for our escape. I was always a math geek, good with numbers, but kinda hopeless with talk. Now I know that these things are one and the same. And so I speak the spell and get him to speak it in turn. A bank of monitors glow pale blue in a haze before me. And through them I watch the enemy moving around outside the compound. I can even see the negotiator. Unbeknownst to him, he's a lot skinnier and maybe even shorter than before. But basically, he's the same chump he's always been. Our conversation is occasionally broken by sporadic gunfire from the girls, as per my instructions. Keeps him on his toes. And to think I actually once feared this guy, back when he was my gym teacher. Funny thing is this, to be honest, I'm really doing this to spite her. The way she uses and controls me and places limits on me has to warrant a response, doesn't it? And so it's easy to just enter the code and let the auto engineer do the rest. Just a minor adjustment to the collider's geometry. Our collider. Well, now they've cut the power, which is perfect, by the way. Time for candles. We gather in a circle in the center of the living room with all the furniture piled in the corners. We kneel on the hardwood floor marked in chalk with various sigils. Our loudspeakers drown out the enemy with a recording of all of our negotiations, edited so that only the spell remains. The words resound in a disjointed way that breaks and reforms the rhythms of this world. Wife number 7, an old high school classmate, by the way, lies in state beneath the floorboards, sacrificed during the first shootout with the feds. She'd already been missing the kids. Apparently, before all of this went down, I'd instructed the men to leave with all of the children. And now these men are scattered across the country, raising my progeny for me. The internet had a word for guys like that back in my old world. My wives, 16 in all, join hands over their fallen sister's grave and stare at me with absolute and blind devotion. But as I raise the silver blasting cap in my own hand, I notice that wife number 1 has altered her expression. I remember this. She was saying to me that the irony is that all of your fantasizing indicates a remarkable lack of creativity on your part. This is because you never do anything. You just waste your time constructing theories. Real creativity requires action, she would say. So when are you going to do something? When are you going to take action? Looking from across the circle at me now, her face has regained that familiar mixture of contempt and pity that she'd always had for me. And it's at this point I realize why it had been so easy for me to alter the collider. Why the security was so lax that evening. I thought I'd been defying her. First, she used humiliation. And then praise, ridiculous praise, to be honest. And as the rest of the group gazes at me in groveling servitude, it occurs to me just how embarrassing my fantasies really are. To me, all this cult stuff was just nonsense, an easy scam that I'd somehow manifested through the power of my will. But now it's finally dawned on me that I am in a cult. A much bigger one than just this particular group. One that goes back to my previous life. To the collider. A cult from which there is no escape. Because I succumbed to my pride. I looked down at my hands. The blasting cap trembling in my fingers. It takes all of my willpower to look back up at Lucy and meet her eyes, now that I know the truth. See, she'd always been the boss. But now her face is altered again. And I see something else, some sort of a plea, a gesture of kindness, of hope perhaps. Most likely the gentlest of final pushes. Oh, hell. Guess it's time to grow up. My thumb presses down on the blasting cap before I have time to change my mind or even prepare myself for this next collision.
Have you ever met a person who you think is soulless? Our next story is about a man whom everyone believes is crazy because he claims to be able to see people who were born without souls. Here is Supply and Demand by William Meikle.
Supply and Demand by William Meikle. The man who walked into my office was old school through and through. A squad of little old ladies on Harris had toiled for years to make his suit. His tie was knotted just right, and his brogue squeaked as he walked across the room. He looked to be in his 70s, but held his back ramrod straight. He strode into the room as if he owned it and thrust a hand at me that I couldn't refuse to shake.
Thanks for seeing me, Doctor.
In truth, I didn't have any option. All psych cases from the ER were referred straight to me, and the call had come in about this strange little man in reception less than 5 minutes before. I didn't quite know what to make of him yet. All I knew was that he had thrown a screaming fit when an orderly approached him. He sat down across the desk from me and smiled.
I'm not mad, you know.
"Prove it," I said, smiling back. He crossed his legs, making sure that the seams on his trouser legs were straight and that no ankle was showing above his sock before he was happy to relax.
Doctor, do you believe in God?
Yes.
Good. That'll make this easier. I started to notice this nearly 30 years ago.
Notice what?
Give me a chance and I'll tell you. But first, another question, if I may. Do you think you have a soul?
Yes, I'm not overly religious, but I do believe that there's something that survives us. Call it a soul if you must.
An interesting position for a scientific man to take, is it not?
More common than you might think. But we're not here to talk about me. Do you have a point?
Yes, and as I said, I'm getting to it.
He fiddled with his cuffs, making sure that just the right amount of shirt showed.
One of the perils of getting old is that the world changes around you so much. And back then, when I started to see them, it was still the 70s. And the world had already changed so much that I thought they were just another manifestation.
They?
Patience. Yes, I'm sure you hear about them all the time from your own patients. But I'm not ready for the tinfoil hat. Not yet. No, what I was seeing was children. Little children. Children with blank stares. Children with no joy in their hearts. Children without souls. And doctor, they were everywhere.
He stopped, sudden tears running down his cheeks. It's not uncommon. As we get older, we get disassociated from the consensus reality, and...
Listen, doctor, I'm old. I'm not stupid. For 30 years, I've watched them. And now they're in positions of power. Policemen, doctors, lawyers, and soon they're going to be politicians. And where will we be then?
I don't quite understand what you're trying to tell me.
The soulless, doctor. They're walking the earth in the millions. And their numbers are growing.
His tears coursed freely now, and he started to get agitated. My hand crept closer to my panic button, but I didn't hit it.
As far as I can work it out, there are two reasons. One of them gives me slight hope for my own future, but neither is good news. Either God has given up on us completely, in which case it's all over but the shouting.
Or
there's only a finite number of souls available at any one time, and we're growing too fast for God to keep up.
Don't you think that God, being God, would have factored that in?
I don't know. Maybe he did. Maybe he never meant for us to get so far ahead of ourselves. And here's what really worries me, doctor. Maybe what I'm seeing is his way of telling us that our time is up.
He started to look around him as if afraid he was being watched. I tried to keep my voice low and calm. And why do you think only you are seeing whatever it is that you're seeing? He was quiet for a long time before answering.
I think everybody sees them. It's just they choose not to notice. Look around you. Violence is escalating everywhere. People get killed for little more than the coin in their pocket. Babies become addicted to drugs before they're born. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. Our moral compass is broken and we know it. We just choose to look the other way while the numbers of the soulless grow and we sink ever closer to the end. And doctor, there's nothing I can do about it.
When the orderly came in, the old man took one look at him and screamed even louder.
Oh my God, look, he's one of them.
Eventually, it took 3 orderlies and a dose of Thorazine to quiet the old man. He had one last look at me as he was carried out.
Just look, doctor. Please look.
I watched the orderlies carry him off down the corridor. Then went to the one place I knew I could trust to lift my spirits after such an encounter. The maternity ward was, as usual, full of hustle and bustle. Along the far wall, a row of fathers looked into the recovery area where row after row of newborn babies lay. Just looking at them always calmed me, reassured me that despite all the sad despair I saw every day, there was some hope in new life. But today was different. The babies lay still, quiet. Their dark, cold stares followed me as I walked quickly away. The end.
And finally, for our last story of the night, we enter a world where corporate executives do not get to retire, they get retired. Permanently. By the amazing author, Noel Plaugher, we present to you The Edge of Conflict Resolution.
The Edge of Conflict Resolution by Noel Plaugher. Conrad Koenig rode the ascending elevator in a state of focused, relaxed meditation. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep. One of his hands handheld the handle of his briefcase. The other rested lightly on the hilt of his steel katana. It was a long ride up to the top, but one that the high-achieving business leader was used to. The Macmillan building was over 100 stories tall. As high as it rose, though, it was only average in the shimmering glass and steel skyline of the vast and towering megalopolis that was Ipan City. Conrad kept at bay the noise and bustle of people getting on and off the elevator. He only opened his eyes when he felt the brush of another executive's katana, albeit softly and unavoidably, against his leg. It was hard to avoid incidental contact in the close confines of the elevator, so Conrad, like all executives, never took offense. An executive had to be gracious and judicious, as everyone makes mistakes. Executive etiquette dictated that a slight was only to be avenged if purposeful. Once Conrad arrived at the 103rd floor, he allowed everyone to get off ahead of him, and then purposefully stepped into the hallway. He paused momentarily to adjust his tie and give a slight brush to his sleeves, more out of obsessive ritual than from cleanliness. Lastly, he adjusted the katana so that the blade was facing up. He knew that the morning's meeting could be contentious, and he didn't want to be caught at a disadvantage. His new rival, Hamilton, would likely try to suggest a counter to the proposal he was planning to make. If it went to a duel, Conrad was ready. As Koenig rounded the corner and passed a glass-walled lobby at the administration floor, he started to count his breaths. It helped to calm his mind and body. He had learned to govern himself, the one and only thing that was ever under his control. As he moved through the overly wide automatic glass door and past the reception desk, he continued to practice the centering techniques that he had learned during his earliest days in executive training. Even though many years had passed since then, he still could hear the words of his first instructor echoing in his mind. One must center oneself before a meeting and be ready for any eventuality. Every interaction has the potential for combat. Never forget it. The instructor had looked each of them in the eye in turn for what seemed like a long time to hammer his point home. Conrad believed that his remarkable success as an executive was due in part to never having wavered from that first and most important principle. The memory was vivid for Conrad and still shocking when he reflected upon his first meeting. The chief financial officer was struck down by the chairman. The CFO had been noticeably upset even before the confrontation began. His presentation on the decline on the fourth quarter sales had been rambling, as if he had come to the meeting fully prepared to discuss it. He had no real explanation or justification for the failure. Then, when the chairman rose, assumed the fighting stance, and drew his sword, the CFO seemed utterly astounded. He looked like someone who had never imagined he might actually have to duel that day. A foolish mistake, a deadly one. Every day had the potential for a duel. Every day. When the CFO drew his sword, he was visibly uncentered, something anyone could easily detect. No doubt the entire boardroom sensed that the CFO was about to be struck down. The controller clearly knew it. He was apparently readying himself to take his boss's position. As his hand had dropped from the methodical caress of his pen to touch the long handle of his katana, everyone around the table must have noticed the move. Most had likely already made their personal calculation and decided that they weren't willing to risk involvement. When it was over, the controller would be the new CFO. From the first hint of confrontation, the combatants' focus was so intense that they must have been oblivious to the lunch delivery coming through the door. The chairman and the CFO stood as still as pillars, eyes locked on each other. They began to sidestep in unison for a better position to fight inside the fully furnished conference room. Sarah, the executive assistant, quietly slipped through the door and was kind enough to hand Conrad his roast beef on sourdough with lettuce and tomato. She squinted her welcoming smile at him. He returned a knowing nod in acknowledgement. She then tiptoed quietly out of the conference room, as if careful not to draw attention away from the duel. Mouthing the words, "I'll come back later with the coffee," she slipped back out of the room as quietly as she had entered, softly closing the door behind her. The two executives stood facing each other, silent, steely-eyed, poised for combat. The CFO's suit was beginning to show the familiar signs of impending failure. Everyone in the room could witness the dark circles of sweat growing larger under the armpits of his charcoal gray suit. Even from Conrad's seat, far from the action, he could see beads of sweat forming and streaming down the CFO's face. The man looked scared. The chairman, in contrast, appeared to be masterfully composed. He seemed cool and relaxed, projecting the highest level of unity of mind, body, and spirit. In a flash of silver, the CFO attacked. The arc of the strike rose and then fell on a diagonal line toward the neck of the chairman, but it was quickly and easily blocked. The chairman then countered with a horizontal slice across the body of the CFO, which started on one side of his torso and then split across his abdomen. The chairman quickly moved away and out of the range of the CFO's sword. The grimace on the injured man's face was a twisted and intense look that betrayed the excruciating pain of being sliced open. Then he became expressionless, melting lower, falling to his knees, and finally ending up face down to the floor. Everyone watched, starkly silent, as his life force drained away. It had been a tough first meeting for Conrad as he looked around at the wide eyes, the disbelieving head shakes, and noted the big exhalations of acknowledgement all around him. Most of his co-workers, like himself, had just come out of executive training and hadn't unsheathed their katana in a real confrontation yet. It gave them all pause. They knew that sooner or later they would be putting their skills to work. For now, though, the situation was over, and the room seemed to relax. No one looked up when the bodymen appeared for removal and cleanup. As everyone had already begun eating their lunch, Conrad looked around for Sarah to see if she had returned with the coffee yet. It was a powerful lesson that Conrad Koenig never forgot. With every subsequent meeting, he went on remembering the first one. He knew the best preparation was a calm mind, a mind ready to either propose a sound idea or to strike a deadly blow in combat. Both were equally important. It didn't matter how good your ideas were if you couldn't defend them with deadly force. Your briefcase and your katana form your dual source of power, and it would serve every executive well to never forget it. Not if they wanted to survive. Sudden death was accepted in the life of the executive. As Conrad approached the conference room, he took note of all the prior arrivals to make sure that he would be the last one to enter. That was his plan. He always liked to arrive later and hopefully make his opponent anxious about his appearance. Though Conrad had made his presentation on the best marketing programs many times before, he instinctively felt that there would be a disruption this time. It wasn't just Hamilton. He knew that there was more than one new executive looking to take his job. And he sensed that this would be the best time for one of them, or possibly all of them, to make their move. Conrad had diligently prepared his presentation over the weekend, verifying all the numbers and making sure that his conclusions aligned with senior management. He didn't want to do battle with everyone at once. He needed management on his side to avoid having to deal with two groups of opponents at once. Conrad had a long-term strategy. First, he would deal with the challengers, and then he would make his own move for the senior vice president's position at the executive retreat later in the year. He knew that the popularity of the current SVP was waning, and he suspected that he would be welcomed if he successfully won his duel. He had every intention of winning. He walked through the door into the conference room and addressed everyone at once. "It seems that I'm a bit late," he said. "I had to pick up my suit from the cleaners and, well, you know how that is." Conrad finished with his $1 million smile and a charming wink that took in nearly everyone. Hamilton, the newest executive fresh out of training, was the only one who didn't smile back. When Conrad put down his briefcase, he snuck a look under the table, an old technique, and saw that Hamilton had his hand resting on his katana. After he gave his presentation, Conrad looked around the room for questions. The beaming faces of senior management assured him that there would be no challenge from any of them. Conrad then started stepping in reverse, with his back turned toward Hamilton, as he answered a question from a colleague about the use of discounting versus free product for promotion. It was a good question, Conrad thought. As he continued walking backward toward Hamilton, Conrad felt the air shift suddenly as Hamilton rose without warning behind him. He knew the man was starting to draw his katana. Conrad unsheathed his sword faster, stabbing backward unexpectedly. He never looked at Hamilton, but he knew by instinct that he had stabbed him low in the abdomen, certain that he had pierced at least one major organ. Conrad turned. Hamilton's face was a static mask of surprise and pain. He slowly fell to his knees and then to the floor, gasping for air, before finally expiring. Conrad observed his rival lying lifeless on the floor in a dark crimson puddle. He was the victor. He grabbed a napkin off the table and wiped the blood from his blade with one motion of his wrist. Conrad smiled, sheathed his sword, closed his briefcase. Casually folding his arms, he asked, "Are there any more questions?" The end.
Well, there you go. Another trip to Planet Raconteur. On behalf of myself and our two fine raconteurs, Papa Dave and Bobby Anthem, we would like to thank you for listening once again. All of the stories presented on Planet Raconteur are used by permission or are in the public domain. Check out the show notes for details on the authors, their websites, and their other releases. And if you like what we are doing, please subscribe and follow us on all of our social media platforms. The links will be found in those same show notes. Much love, and thank you again for visiting the Planet Raconteur.